Dad, this house is already mine." Clara's words cut through the room sharper than any knife on the table. The air went still like the moment before a storm breaks. She sat tall, her chin lifted pearls, catching the chandelier's light eyes gleaming with a confidence that was not hers alone. She had borrowed it from the people sitting beside her, the Mercers who looked at me as if I were a temporary custodian of something that rightly belonged to them. According to the law, children can inherit early to prevent assets from being wasted. It is safer if the transfer happens now. Her voice was steady, rehearsed, as though she had practiced it in front of a mirror, or been coached word for word. Across from her, Augustine Mercer, 32, in his tailored suit and polished shoes, gave her a small, approving nod. He had the posture of a man who believed the world would bend for him. His father, Gerald, leaned back with a thin smile, the kind that belonged to men who won cases not with truth, but with intimidation. Sylvia, his wife, turned her glass slowly in her hand, eyes narrowing at me like I was a nuisance at my own table. At the far end, my younger daughter, Isolde, sat frozen, her hands clenched together, lips pressed tight, 26 years old, but looking suddenly much younger, caught between loyalty to her sister and fear for me. The house we were sitting in was mine, every board and beam. I had signed the papers, written the checks, walked these halls at sunrise for over a decade. Yet my daughter declared it hers, as if my life's work could be erased with a sentence. I set my fork down. The sound of metal against porcelain rang too loud in the silence that followed. Clara leaned closer, her tone sharpening. "You cannot keep this place forever. You can barely manage it now. Augustine and I can take care of it. Think about how much stress you would be free from if you let us handle everything." Her eyes were on me, but her words were meant for the audience around the table, her in-laws, her fiancé, the people she wanted to impress. "This is not your future anymore. It is ours." Gerald adjusted his cufflinks, speaking with the slow authority of a man who believed the law bent to his interpretation. "Early property transfer prevents legal complications. I have guided many families through it. It protects everyone's interests." Sylvia raised her glass, a smile that did not touch her eyes. "Responsible families know when to hand things over. I am glad Clara understands that." I breathed deep, the smell of roasted chicken and garlic butter thick in the air. The ocean breeze slipped faintly through the open window, but it could not wash away the bitterness building inside me. My pulse beat heavy in my temples, but I kept my expression calm. I had faced tougher rooms in my life, courtrooms, boardrooms, men who wanted to strip me down to nothing. But never before had I faced my own daughter demanding the very roof over my head. Clara's gaze slid to the bottle I had brought. "Grocery store wine, $18 at most." Her lips twisted into a smirk. "This is pathetic. You bring cheap wine, you drive that old truck, you dress like a janitor, and you expect us to take you seriously. You should be grateful I am willing to take this burden before it collapses with you." Isolde whispered my name, Dad. Her voice small, but no one else seemed to hear. Augustine leaned back, smirk widening, enjoying the spectacle. Clara's cheeks burned red, her hand trembling slightly as it wrapped around her glass of wine. Then she snapped. With a sharp flick, she hurled the glass across the table. It struck my chest, red liquid splashing across my shirt, dripping onto the white tablecloth and pooling by the plates. Gasps broke out around the room. Sylvia recoiled, muttering in disgust. Gerald shook his head as if disappointed in a misbehaving child. Augustine leaned forward, watching me carefully, waiting for me to lash out. The wine ran down my chest, warm at first, then cold. I did not move. My hands stayed steady on the table. I stared at Clara, the little girl who once fell asleep against my shoulder, who used to laugh at fireworks in the summer sky, who now looked at me like a man to be removed, not a father to be loved. Her breath came ragged shoulders rising and falling. The anger in her eyes flickered, replaced by something else, something unsteady. Her face drained of color. She staggered her chair, scraping back with a harsh sound. Then without a word, she crumpled. Her body hit the rug with a dull thud, pearls scattering like bones across the floor. Sylvia screamed the sound high and sharp. Augustine dropped to his knees, shaking her shoulder, shouting her name. Gerald barked at someone to call for a doctor. Isolde rushed forward, kneeling beside her sister, tears already in her eyes. I stayed where I was, the stains spreading across my shirt, the storm breaking loose around me. In the chaos, I felt only stillness, a cold clarity that settled deep. This was not the end, not by far. This was only the first thunderclap. The real storm had yet to come. In 1995, I signed my name on a loan slip for $40,000 and walked out of the bank in Savannah with my stomach twisted tight. It was more money than I had ever borrowed, and less than what I really needed, but it was all they would give me. That money went into a weathered duplex on Victory Drive, paint-peeling pipes, leaking a roof that sagged like tired shoulders. People told me I was crazy. They told me I was buying myself a money pit. I told myself I was buying a chance. I spent nights on that roof with a hammer, hands blistered and back aching, patching shingles one by one. I scraped walls until the dust choked me, laid tile crooked at first, then straight, once I learned replaced toilets with instructions smudged by grease on my fingers. During the day, I worked odd jobs hauling lumber, patching drywall for contractors, driving deliveries. At night, I went back to the duplex and kept at it until the neighbors turned off their lights. The first tenants were a young couple with a baby. They handed me rent in cash, small bills folded neat, and I felt like I was holding proof that the risk had been worth it. I fixed their leaky faucet at midnight once and realized that was the job now. I was the landlord, the handyman, the collector, the janitor, all in one. But the mortgage shrank month by month, and slowly the place stopped bleeding me and started feeding me. I rolled every dollar back into the next property. A shotgun house near the river, then a triplex in Midtown, then a stretch of foreclosures when the banks got careless. I drove around Savannah in that old Ford pickup with tools rattling in the back and a notebook full of numbers on the passenger seat. I wore the same flannel shirts until they frayed at the collar, ate cheap takeout, while calculating interest and taxes by hand at my kitchen table. In 2003, I filed paperwork for Whitaker Coastal Holdings. The name sounded bigger than I was, just one man with a truck and a set of calloused hands, but I needed something official. The bank clerks stopped rolling their eyes when I came in for loans. Realtors started calling me instead of ignoring me. By 2008, I had a dozen properties under my belt, and the downturn hit like a hammer. Where others saw disaster, I saw fire sales. Families walked away from mortgages they could no longer carry, and banks begged for buyers. I signed papers faster than I ever thought possible. By 2012, I had crossed 50 doors. Some were run-down apartments. Some were single-family houses. A few were vacation homes near Tybee and Hilton Head that tourists rented by the week. I learned the rhythm of renovation crews, the sound of hammers at dawn, the smell of fresh drywall mud. I also learned to sit in silence when people called me lucky, as if luck had carried sheetrock on my shoulders, or wired outlets until my fingers cramped. From the outside, I looked like any man barely scraping by. I kept driving that Ford, the paint faded to a dull blue, the odometer rolling past 150,000. I bought my clothes from Walmart, cheap jeans and flannel, the kind you could wear until the seams gave way. At dinner parties, I brought wine under $20. People smirked when they saw the label, but I never cared. Let them laugh. It kept eyes off me. What they never saw was the safe in my office where I kept my other treasures. Not money, not contracts, but watches. Old Omega and Longines pieces I picked up at estate sales, a Patek once that I bought from a jeweler who had no idea what he held. Each tick of those hands reminded me of the hours I had worked, the hours I had bought back. Next to the watches were cameras, Leica rangefinders, that still smelled faintly of leather, a Hasselblad that captured light like no digital machine could. On the wall hung maps with pins stuck in places where I had traveled alone, slipping into foreign cities where nobody knew my name, drinking coffee at street corners without anyone asking what I was worth. By 2020, Whitaker Coastal Holdings held more than 200 properties across Georgia, the Carolinas, and Florida. In 2025, the portfolio was valued at $95 million a number. I hardly spoke out loud because it sounded unreal even to me. Every unit was maintained, rented, cleaned, and accounted for every tenant, a reminder of the machine I had built with my own hands. Still, I kept my disguise, To neighbors, I was the man in the old truck with dirt under his nails. To clerks at the grocery store, I was the guy buying bargain wine. Even to Clara, I was the father who patched leaks and drove himself tired. She never asked what lay behind the office door, never wondered why I spent evenings bent over spreadsheets instead of television. That was fine. I preferred it that way. The less they knew, the quieter I could work. I had no need for applause or recognition. But sometimes when I walked down River Street and saw tourists drinking overpriced cocktails, when I listened to men brag about their vacation homes and rental portfolios, I felt a cold kind of amusement. They did not know the man standing beside them on the sidewalk owned more property than all of them combined. People called me a ghost without knowing it. Tenants saw a maintenance truck pull up and thought the landlord had sent a worker. Realtors closed deals with shell companies and never realized they were all mine. My name appeared in tax records, but no one ever looked close enough. I was there, and not there a shadow moving behind deeds and leases. And that was how I wanted it. Because when people think you are poor, when they underestimate you, they show you who they really are. They show you what they think you deserve, and that is worth more than any mask you could buy. No one at that dinner table, not Clara, not the Mercers, not even Isolde, knew the truth. To them, I was still the man with the faded truck, the frayed shirt, the cheap wine. But beneath that mask stood the owner of an empire, the quiet phantom of Southern real estate. And the night Clara threw her glass, she reminded me why I had built it in silence all along. I learned to work in silence long before my children were old enough to understand what that meant. When Clara turned 22 and moved to Nashville to chase content and brand deals, I set up an automatic transfer so she would not have to call every time rent was due. It began lower, then crept upward with each new reason she gave me. By the time she hit her late 20s, it was $12,500 every month landing in her account, like the tide, steady and predictable. I told myself it was a bridge, a way to keep her safe while she figured out how to stand. Somewhere along the way, it became a floor she did not think she could ever live without. I remember the day she asked for the increase that brought it to that number. She talked about metrics and impressions, how a larger apartment would mean better backdrops, how a new car lease would help her reach certain clients. She said, image is everything, and the image has a price. I told her I would make the transfer. The requests never sounded like requests. Rent due on the 1st. None of it was framed as a favor. It was framed as necessity, and I learned to answer with a simple, I will handle it because that kept the peace. Peace, I learned, can be its own form of quiet failure. At night, I would sit at my kitchen table, spreadsheet, open numbers, steady and honest under the lamp. I would open Clara's feed and see a version of her life that did not include Michon. There she was on a balcony with city lights behind her, wearing a dress that sparkled like water. She wrote captions about the grind and the hustle, about building a life from scratch. When Clara called, it was rarely to talk about anything from my world. She wanted to confirm that the transfer had gone through, or to vent about a brand that changed a brief at the last minute. Every time I tried to say anything about my day, the call moved back to her. She did not notice, and I let it pass because pointing it out felt like begging. There was a kind of logic to her world that did not bend toward gratitude. If the allowance arrived, then it was normal. If it did not arrive, it was a crisis. On the few occasions when a bank holiday delayed the deposit, my phone lit up with messages that started calm and ended sharp. What she did not say was, "Dad, how are you?" She would ask in passing, the way you ask a cashier as you swipe your card. The question hung in the space between words and fell through without a sound. Isolde moved differently through life. She would sit at my kitchen table with her hair in a simple knot and tell me about her students. She talked about the boy who had discovered he could read a full page without losing his place, about the girl who cried when a class plant finally sprouted. Sometimes she helped me on small jobs when my crew was booked. She held a flashlight while I traced a breaker, or she passed me screws while I reattached a cabinet door. I did not set out to make one daughter soft and the other strong. With Clara, I smoothed every bump because I feared that a bump would break us. With Isolde, I learned to say no or not now, or you can handle this, because she showed me she could. Clara came home for holidays sometimes. She would arrive late in a rental car I had paid for, drag glossy suitcases across the floor, complain that the house had poor light for photos. She would push her plate away, half-eaten, and say the seasoning was heavy, then take a photo of the table with a caption about family time. Isolde washed the dishes and left leftovers labeled in the fridge. On her way back to Nashville, Clara would hug me quickly and whisper that next year would be different, that the next campaign was the one that she would finally be able to cover more of her own costs. Weeks would stretch into months. I would see her in the glow of my phone more than I saw her on my porch. One spring, she called breathless from an airport. A brand wanted a week of content in Miami. She needed a down payment for a photographer and a deposit for a studio rental. I transferred the funds the same afternoon. The next month, she called about a higher rent. The next month, she called about a car lease change. The next month, she said the algorithm had shifted and she needed to rebrand. The months melted together until they felt like one long request. Isolde found me one evening sitting in the dark of my living room. She handed me tea and asked if I was sleeping. She did not press. She said her class had planted tomatoes and that the sprouts were a miracle. She said that I should see them. I stood in a classroom that smelled like crayons and damp soil and watched children cheer for a stem that had pushed through dirt. I thought about how long it takes to grow anything worth keeping. I thought about what happens when you water something that does not want to root. The gap between my daughters grew in ways I did not know how to measure. I loved them both in the way a man breathes without thinking how. The gap was in the muscles we had built. Clara had trained the muscle that reaches for more and expects it to arrive. Isolde had trained the muscle that stays and tries again. The day I admitted that to myself alone at the kitchen table, with a watch ticking beside my elbow, I felt the ache of a truth I had dodged for years. What hurt most was not the money. I can make more or less of it, and the world will keep spinning. What hurt was the quiet after our calls, the space where a daughter might say, "Tell me about your day," and mean it. I flipped through calendar pages in my head and tried to remember a time she had sat across from me and asked that simple thing without needing anything in return. I could not find one. That failure did not roar. It settled like dust, and it stayed. And on the night of the dinner, when the glass flew and red spread across my shirt, that dust rose and made the air hard to breathe. I saw the shape of what I had built, and what I had allowed, and what I would no longer accept. Outside, the ocean kept its rhythm, as if nothing had changed at all. Augustine showed up before his parents did a test balloon to see how easy the air would be to breathe. He said, "You really hang on to the classics, boomer style, and let the words hang in the air, like a joke that did not need a laugh." I asked him about his work, and he told me about Mercer Realty in Atlanta, about legacy assets and acquisition pipelines, about taking meetings at golf clubs where deals are drawn on napkins before lawyers turn them into stone. When he asked how I managed the house, the expenses, the maintenance, the question carried a soft condescension under the varnish of interest. It was the tone of a man who believed I was one surprise bill away from folding. He said a house like this takes a lot out of a man your age. He said there are ways to streamline. There are structures that move property more efficiently between generations. A week later, I met his parents. Gerald stepped through the front door and took in the room like a man assessing a courtroom. He asked about parking, zoning, flood insurance, the tax basis on my original purchase. Sylvia floated in behind him, tall and elegant at 60, an interior designer with a portfolio that lived on high-gloss pages. She touched the edge of a side table and frowned at the varnish, then smiled beautifully at me and said, "The house had very good bones." I had laid out a simple spread for them, shrimp I had bought from a man at the docks, a salad that smelled of lemon and dill, and yes, a bottle of wine from the grocery store. She poured a glass and took a polite sip, then set it down with a gracious nod that carried the softest edge of pity. At dinner, Gerald spoke about families and the things that keep them from tearing themselves apart. He said he had seen too many disputes over property, that good intentions rot when paperwork lags behind reality. He said any responsible patriarch should think about transition, about the legal tools that protect what he has built. Early transfer, he said, and dabbed at his mouth with linen. Clara watched me over the flowers, waiting to see if I would flinch. I asked Gerald which tools he preferred, and he spoke at length about vehicles and instruments, about strategies that kept assets inside the family line. He smiled when he said family line, and let his eyes fall on Clara in a way that told me which line he meant. He never asked how I had structured my affairs, never asked if I had counsel of my own, never considered the possibility that a man who looks like me might have thought of these things before he learned to shave. After dinner, Sylvia suggested a quick look at the guest house. She said Clara had shown her photos of the cottage, and she had visions for making it more usable. Augustine added that short-term rental rates could double with the right aesthetic. Inside the cottage, Sylvia paused at a framed photo of me and the girls when they were small, the three of us in matching windbreakers after a storm had cleared. She said children grow so fast, then suggested the frame would be better in a hallway. Back in the main house, Gerald asked to see my office to discuss a few harmless questions. I told him that room was private and offered the deck instead. He described a scenario in which an early transfer of this house to Clara would lock in certain advantages and protect against hazards such as age, illness, or market fluctuations. He said he could prepare a simple packet, a letter of intent language that framed the matter as an intergenerational allocation rather than a sale. He said all the best families do it before problems arise. Clara watched me as he spoke, eager eyes bright. Augustine flicked a speck of lint from his sleeve and smiled toward the water. Isolde stood by the door with her hands in her pockets, her face careful and still. I asked Gerald what would happen if the patriarch preferred to keep his property under his own control while he was alive. Gerald said such arrangements could be respected, of course, but that courts and tax agencies often respond more kindly to forward-thinking families. Then he laughed softly and said the law is practical, not sentimental, and it rewards those who move before they must. The conversation drifted back to the dining room where Sylvia had arranged the dishes for a photograph. She asked Clara to stand by the window, then suggested she change her earrings for something that would catch light in the video. Clara obeyed with the cheerful speed of a favored client. I excused myself and stepped onto the deck. The sky had darkened to velvet. The air tasted like salt and thyme. I could hear the Mercer voices through the door, layered and smooth, discussing lighting plans and timelines and schedules. They were not visiting a home. They were touring an acquisition. Isolde followed me outside and stood beside me without speaking. She placed her elbow against mine for a moment, a small touch, then let it fall. She said I made good shrimp, and I told her she had carried the whole night on her back. She smiled and looked out at the water. After a while, she went back in to help with dishes, because she's the kind of person who always does. I stayed on the deck and let the sounds wash over me. Laughter when Sylvia repositioned a chair. A murmur of approval when Gerald described a clause that would make a transfer appear seamless. Augustine promising to introduce Clara to a photographer who could make this house look like a magazine spread. Clara agreeing to everything with the breathless ease of someone who had already written the caption. I thought about the duplex on Victory Drive, about roofs and pipes and mortgages. I thought about the bank clerk who had once looked at my loan application and said, "You sure you want this?" I thought about the years I had spent learning when to speak and when to keep my mouth shut. And I knew with a clarity that settled into my bones that the Mercers had not come here to blend families. They had come to collect. So I poured myself another small glass of that cheap wine and let it breathe against my tongue, as if the simple taste could anchor me to the man I had chosen to be. I walked back inside and thanked everyone for coming. I complimented Sylvia's eye and Gerald's concern and Augustine's energy. I handed Clara her coat when she asked for it and watched her tuck her phone into the pocket with a satisfied little smile. I said good night, closed the door behind them, and stood very still in the quiet that followed. The house held its breath. Somewhere a board settled with a soft pop. I listened to it the way you listen for the first crack in ice, and told myself the truth I had been circling all evening. They were not after a seat at my table. They were after the table itself. And there was no reason to tell them yet that I had built the table and could move it any time I pleased. The envelope arrived by courier on a bright Thursday. Mercer and Fox, LLP. I signed for it on the front step, thanked the kid who handed it over, then took it to my office and slid a finger under the flap. The letter was wooden and confident, the way lawyers write when they expect you to nod along. It described an intergenerational allocation. It said that early transfer would safeguard the asset from potential tax exposure and potential creditor claims, and that in light of my age and the present climate, prudence dictated a forward step now. It invited me to acknowledge receipt and confirm cooperation within a short window. I read it twice slowly, then once more out loud to the empty room. The house we were sitting in when Clara rehearsed this very argument was not a family heirloom. It was a line item on a closing statement I had signed in 2012 with cash I had earned. The letter knew that, or perhaps Gerald preferred not to. My phone buzzed. Clara. She said the letter had gone out, and that this meant we were finally moving forward. She said the paperwork would make things clean, and that the house would be safe from random disasters that older owners might invite when their health declines. I stared at the message until the screen dimmed. Then I placed the phone face down. Another buzz. Augustine. He wrote that his father specialized in untangling messy family situations long before they got messy. He said our transition would set Clara up for years and free me from headaches, and that we could execute everything with minimal fuss if I responded promptly. I stood, walked to the window, and watched a gull balance on the rail of the deck, tips of its wings fluttering against the breeze. I cared about title deeds and hard numbers and that little muscle in my chest that clenched whenever my daughter used the word ours for something my hands had carried across a decade. I read the letter one more time. Family property. Intergenerational allocation. Protect against contingencies. Each line was a soft push toward surrender dressed up as counsel. There was a paragraph that implied children possess a right to request a transfer in order to preserve value against tax inefficiency and potential insolvency. I placed the pages back in the envelope and slid it into the bottom drawer with the file of purchase documents and insurance certificates. I did not write back. I did not call. I let silence do the heavy lifting. People like Gerald do not know what to do with quiet. No answer moves the board. Clara called instead of texting. Her voice carried that bright energy that had hooked 500,000 strangers and turned them into fans. She asked if I had seen the letter. I said I had. She told me this was the most practical way forward. She said she had spoken with a tax advisor who agreed. I did not ask for the advisor's name. She explained that time is of the essence and that the sooner we sign, the sooner the house can be shielded. The word "our" pressed against my ear like a thumb on a bruise. After we hung up, I walked the house. I ran my hand along the banister I had sanded myself. I stood in the kitchen and looked at the stove where I had taught both girls to make eggs. Later that afternoon, Isolde stopped by with a bag of groceries. She found me on the deck with the envelope at my feet. She asked if I had eaten. I said not yet. She set bread and fruit on the table, then caught sight of the letter and tilted her head. She did not ask what it said. She knows what silence means in my house. She told me one of her students had learned to tie a shoe today, and that the whole class had clapped. She told me the tomato plants were stretching for the sun. When she left, she squeezed my shoulder and said she would be back Saturday with muffins. That night I drafted a response in my head. It began with the deed. It continued with the math. I did not send it. Mercy is wasted on men who frame your life as a clerical task. I slept a few hours and woke before dawn. I brewed coffee and watched the first pale light turn the water to brushed steel. I thought about the difference between letting a thing go and having it taken. One is a choice. The other is a theft dressed in etiquette. I remembered the way Gerald's eyes slid toward Clara when he said family line. I remembered Sylvia's hand testing the table, as if it already belonged to her. I remembered Augustin calling my truck boomer style and smiling, as if the joke had been generous. In the morning mail, there was a second envelope lighter than the first. It was a draft memo language designed to read like a mutual understanding. It scheduled a call for the following week and invited me to consider how best to announce the transition to our community. It suggested that Clara could lead with content that framed the story as responsible stewardship. It even included sample language that presented me as a visionary father, planning wisely for the next generation. I placed the second envelope on top of the first. I took both to the safe and set them beside the watches. I locked the door and put the key back in my pocket. Then I made 2 phone calls that had nothing to do with the Mercers. One to the contractor who had just finished a renovation in Beaufort to confirm final numbers. One to a cleaning crew that needed additional hours approved. These were the kinds of calls that build a life. The other kind only tries to rearrange it. By late afternoon, Clara texted again to ask if I had any questions. I could see Augustin's reflection in the mirror behind her small, but present a shadow in a room that was not mine. I did not answer. There is a point past which conversation becomes confession. I was not interested in telling them where my lines were. I wanted them to step over them on their own. As the sun fell, the water turned the color of copper. I stood on the deck and knew what I would do. I would not fight this in corners or in emails that could be spun. I would take their tidy script and rip it in front of the same audience that had encouraged it. I would show them what family property looks like when the man who built it speaks plainly. There are moments when a plan does not need words. It settles into the body like breath. I closed the door, turned off the lights one by one, and let the house fall quiet around me. The next time we met in public, I would move the table they thought they were seated at, and I would make sure there were witnesses. Hay dressed the house like a magazine spread and called it a celebration. Clara made her entrance. Augustine waited at the bottom in a tuxedo that announced his confidence before he spoke. Comments flew so quickly, they looked like rain. People said the place looked dreamy. People begged for a tour. A few of the guests glanced at me the way you glance at staff. I stood near a window with a glass of that grocery store wine and let the tide of conversation wash around me. Behind them, a man with an expensive tan whispered that the future in-laws were razor sharp and the family was really going places. Gerald and Sylvia circulated like royalty at a garden party. Augustine clasped shoulders and told a group that Savannah and Atlanta would be theirs to shape. They looked at the house as if it had already signed papers in their favor. Isolde arrived quietly and found me near the windows. Then she asked if I needed anything. I told her I was fine and asked how her students were doing. She said they were wild for the tomato plants and that one had tried to name a seed. Clara drifted over with her phone lifted. She framed me in the shot, without warning the father in his habitat, the man rugged and charming when seen from the right angle. She told her audience that I had always loved this house and that it had been such a gift for our family. She thanked them and tapped to flip the camera back to her face. She walked away before I could say a word. Near the buffet, a pair of men in suits talked loudly about property taxes. One said these coastal places are a nightmare for an older owner, then glanced at me and lowered his voice slightly, just enough to be insulting. Another quipped that at least the kid had a plan and rolled his eyes toward Clara. Neither of them looked like they had ever changed an air filter. A woman beside them asked if I was the groundskeeper. When I told her I lived here, she apologized in the way people apologize when they are not sorry. Augustine tapped his glass with a spoon and called for attention. He thanked everyone for coming. He spoke about future vision, a life built together. He used words like partnership and stewardship, then squeezed Clara's hand. People clapped. Sylvia turned to me and said how moving that was. Gerald nodded and said, "This is what responsible families do." Clara lifted her phone again and went live. She narrated the string lights and the polished silver and the ocean beyond the glass, then brought the camera close to her face. She said, "Our beach house is where it all began and where the next chapter will unfold." She said, "We are stepping into the future and we are doing it the right way." A woman with a triangle of diamonds at her throat turned to her friend and said that it was noble to take over for an aging parent. Her friend nodded and said it would be cruel to make an older man manage a place like this alone. Another guest said she admired how well the Mercers had guided the process. She called Gerald a genius and Sylvia a force. Someone else said every family needs a leader to make the hard calls, and I realized they did not mean me. I moved through the house slowly, letting my hand brush the frames on the hallway walls, the ones holding photos of two little girls in rain boots and plastic crowns. I passed the office door without opening it. I walked out to the deck and looked at the path leading to the dunes. The The sea moved the way the sea always moves, steady and beyond everybody's plan. Behind me, laughter spiked when the cake appeared, 4 tiers of white and gold that looked too perfect to eat. Back inside, Clara climbed a step to be seen and thanked everyone again. She spoke about gratitude and family, about how much this place meant to her, and then she said something about responsibility that made people murmur in approval. She announced a toast to legacy, then looked straight at me across the room. For a second, the phone slipped, and I saw her fingers tremble. Glasses lifted, champagne fizzed. Augustine whispered in her ear, and her smile returned. A cluster of guests around me clinked flutes, and one of them patted my shoulder as if I were a retired mascot. He said, "You must be so proud." I said I was. Pride is a shape that can hold more than one thing. The party swelled. Guests spilled onto the deck and down the steps to the yard. Someone spread a blanket under the string lights and posed couples for photos. Gerald spoke in a low circle with 3 men from a bank. Sylvia staged a vignette on the mantel and took a picture for her portfolio. Augustine pulled Clara into a spin, and she laughed while keeping the phone at an angle where her smile looked effortless. Isolde slipped me a plate with 2 crab cakes and a wedge of cake that looked almost too neat to eat. She said quietly that there was not much room for sitting down, and that she had found a chair near the window if I wanted to rest. I told her I was fine. She touched my sleeve and told me not to stand too close to the speakers. As the sun dropped, the house took on that soft evening glow I have always loved. It is the hour when the floors look warm and the walls lean in, and it feels like the home remembers every step you have ever taken inside it. The trio eased into a slower song. Augustine pulled Clara close with one arm, while their friends filmed them in little loops that would later become memories sold to strangers. I watched their shoes trace circles on the hardwood I had laid plank by plank. A group of young guests gathered near me and tried to include me in their banter. One of them decided to be charming and asked me for the story of how I came to work here. Another asked how long I had been managing the grounds. Another said I must know all the secrets of the house. I said I knew enough to keep it standing. Someone laughed a little too loud. Clara announced one more live moment while the cake was cut. She told her viewers that this place had been the foundation of her dreams. She said it had always been a family effort, and that now it would be her and Augustine's turn to carry the torch. She raised her slice toward the camera like a promise. The crowd cheered. The comments flooded. The phone captured a house that glowed. I set my empty glass on a side table and took a slow breath. The floor hummed with footsteps, the air with opinions. All around me, people rearranged a future that did not belong to them. I felt something quiet click into place inside me. I smiled and let the smile stay. None of them knew what the night was really for. They had not seen the table legs I had loosened long before they sat down. They had not noticed the way the room had been set so that the view would shift with a single turn. They were busy filming a story they believed was theirs. I was busy preparing the ending. I waited until the music softened and people drifted back toward the foyer with fresh drinks. "Clara, do you know what it costs to keep this house standing?" Clara laughed a small laugh that was meant to be charming and said we can discuss that later. Property taxes, insurance, storm prep, surprises. Do you know the number? $15,000 a month, sometimes more in hurricane season, for 15 years. Clara stared at me as if I had switched languages. That is $2.8 million in carrying costs since 2010. And most of you here know that is not counting capital projects. The things Instagram never asks about. Clara tried to pivot. She told her audience that maintenance numbers are part of responsible ownership and that this is why transitions matter. Her voice trembled. I held up a thin leather folder. I opened it and pulled out the county tax bill from the last year, a run of utility summaries, a contract for storm shutters I had installed after a near miss 2 summers back. I showed them without flourish paper to faces, names and addresses clear as daylight. A woman I did not know said, "My goodness." A man with the expensive tan swallowed hard. Someone muttered that coastal dreams are not for the faint of heart. The florist sat down on a stair and pressed a hand to her mouth. Clara said, "Dad, stop trying to embarrass me. You are making this weird. We can go over this later." She looked to Gerald as if a stage manager might wave a wand and reset the scene. I turned a page and held up a copy of a closing statement. This was the day I bought this house. Cash from Whitaker Coastal Holdings, 2012. Not a transfer, not a bequest, not a surprise gift from an imaginary ancestor. A purchase. Gerald took a step in my direction and said, "This is not necessary. Property can be categorized in many ways for planning purposes. The law recognizes the fluidity of family assets. The law recognizes title and consideration." I kept my gaze on Clara. "You told half the people in this room and 50,000 more that this house is already yours. It is not. It is mine. I can be generous. I can be foolish. I cannot be erased." Murmurs rippled like wind on water. Clara lowered her phone a fraction. Her lips parted, then closed, then opened again. "But you cannot." The words tumbled out small and high. Gerald said this was how responsible families do it. He said the courts value proactive stewardship. He said the transition protects everyone. Augustine nodded vigorously. He said his father specializes in keeping these situations clean, and that all I needed to do was trust the process. He tried a laugh that did not catch. He said no one wanted conflict. He said we were all on the same team. I flipped to the deed. Names and signatures. The county seal like a watermark of truth. I simply stood and let the paper exist in the space where their story had tried to live. Then I placed the deed on a side table and rested my fingertips on it as if it were a living thing. Clara glanced at Sylvia. Sylvia smoothed her dress and gave a smile meant for cameras. She said, "This is a misunderstanding." She said no one is trying to take anything. She said families evolve and homes must evolve with them. The guests closest to us had formed a half circle without meaning to. A banker I recognized from town stared at the numbers on the tax bill with the fascination of a man who thought he knew what something cost until he learned what it really costs. A couple from Atlanta whispered and then went quiet when they realized their whispers could be heard. Isolde touched my elbow. Her eyes were steady. She inhaled and then let the breath go, a small signal to me that she was there, and the floor was still under my feet. I felt the old calm settle in, the one that had carried me through lean winters and busted pipes and deals that should not have closed, but did. Clara tried again, a new route through the same maze. She said, "No one is erasing you. This is about protecting you. If something happens to you and there is no plan, everything gets complicated. This is the cleanest way. The professionals said so." I nodded as if considering a new tool at a hardware store. Then I said the professionals you are citing sent me a letter that called my home family property, as if the phrase were magic. They suggested that my age presented a risk. They implied that children hold a right to demand transfer for the sake of tax efficiency. That is theater. It is not law. And if a man who claims to be your advocate starts a conversation by redefining what belongs to whom, you should ask yourself who benefits. Gerald tightened his jaw. He said, you are mischaracterizing a good faith proposal. He said if I had concerns, I should have reached out privately instead of putting on a show. I said, this is my house, this is my room. If there is a show, I am the man paying for the lights. For the first time all evening, Clara looked like she had lost her place in the script. The phone in her hand slipped slightly. The comments on her live must have looked like static. She stared at the deed, then at me, then at Augustin Swan. Her voice thinned. But Dad, Mr. Mercer promised this would be simple. He said you would feel relieved. He said the law rewards families that think ahead. He would not say that if it were not true. He would say that if it made his plan easier. I kept my voice soft. Ease is not the same as right. Convenience is not the same as consent. No one moved. Somewhere near the kitchen, a tray clicked against a counter and then stilled. Outside, the ocean sounded closer, as if the tide had crept up the dunes to listen. Clara stepped down from the little rise she had claimed for visibility. She looked at the ring on her hand, as if it might answer. She looked at Sylvia and got a polished smile. She looked at Gerald and got a lawyer's mask. She looked at Augustin and got a nod that said, stay the course. Then she looked at me, and for one beat, I saw the little girl who used to ask if we could get pancakes on Saturdays. The beat passed. Her chin lifted again, but not as high. She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, with fingers that trembled. Her followers were asking what was happening. She did not speak to them. She did not speak to anyone. She stood very still in the silent ring of people who had come to drink and dance, and instead found themselves watching a lesson. I gathered the papers and slid them back into the folder. I did not raise my voice. I did not deliver a speech. I had wanted only to set the floor under the room and feel it hold. It did. The numbers had done what numbers do. They had made the air honest. The band found a tune again, softer this time. A server tiptoed a path behind the crowd. The lanterns swayed on their lines. I placed the folder on the mantel, where the cameras could see it. If they wished, then stepped back to my spot near the window. There was nothing left to say in that moment. The silence said it. The house said it. Even the ocean, with its steady pulse, seemed to agree. I lifted my phone and felt the weight of eyes settle on me. Diana. Need your voice in a room of witnesses. Lawrence, I am here. What do you need? I said I received letters from Mercer and Fox describing my home as family property and proposing an early transfer to my daughter under the idea of intergenerational allocation. The letters implied that my age and speculative financial risks make a transfer urgent. They suggested children possess a right to request a deed change to prevent losses. I asked if that sounds like extortion to you. Diana answered, yes. That language is an attempt to coerce a surrender of title under pressure. It is an effort to leverage fear and public image to obtain property without consideration. In plain terms, it is an attempt to take what does not belong to them. It is improper, and if carried further, it becomes actionable. Gerald said this is irresponsible. You are misrepresenting professional correspondence. He said the letters were a starting point for a family discussion. Diana said any letter that reframes a titled asset as communal property to suggest that a non-owner holds leverage over the owner is a threat dressed as advice. If you intended pressure, then your intent is obvious to any court that cares to read. Sylvia smiled and said, this is so dramatic. Surely you can soften the tone and speak privately. Diana continued, Lawrence, you asked me last year whether to put this house into a trust. You decided to retain title and document your intent in a will. Your paperwork is current and sound. Anyone claiming urgency now is manufacturing it. Anyone claiming a right to demand transfer is wrong on the law and wrong on the facts. Clara said, "This is not about taking. This is about protecting you." Mr. Mercer said, "The courts appreciate proactive families. Dad, we were trying to help." Diana said, "Help does not arrive with a deadline and a threat of legal action if you refuse. Help does not redefine ownership to suit the helper. Help respects the deed." Gerald said, "Any accusation of extortion is out of bounds." His firm had only suggested common instruments. I let the silence stand a moment. Then I lowered the phone and said, "Diana, thank you. Please stay on the line." I reached for a second folder beneath the first, a plain gray one that had lived in my desk for years. There is another matter. It concerns the building at 520 Peachtree Street in Atlanta. 24 floors, stone and glass. You know it, Gerald. Your firm Mercer and Fox occupies 3 of those floors under a long-term lease. Gerald said I fail to see the relevance. The relevance is simple. I own that building. Not in my personal name. In a company called Vesper Capital Holdings. It is a wholly owned subsidiary of Whitaker Coastal Holdings. I acquired the building in 2019 when the previous ownership group collapsed a debt stack. Your lease transferred to me intact. You have been paying rent to my company for almost 6 years. A banker near the stairs made a soft sound in his throat as the math rearranged itself behind his eyes. Sylvia said, "That is impossible. Surely there is some confusion." I held up the lease assignment, then a certificate from the county recorder. I said there is always room for confusion until you put papers in the same room. Then confusion leaves. Augustine stopped smiling. He stared at the documents like they might bite. He glanced at his father. He did not speak. Clara whispered "Dad" under her breath, the word small as a pin. Her hand trembled around the phone. She did not read the comments. She kept her eyes on the pages, then on my face, then on the floor. Gerald said ownership through shells is common. That does not change the merits of his earlier proposal. He said the 2 matters are unrelated. Diana spoke from the mantel. They are related in one important way. They show who is attempting to control the story and who holds the facts. They show motive. They show pressure. They show that Lawrence has thought several moves ahead, while your letters tried to place him in check with an empty threat. I looked at Clara. I told her I do not enjoy this. I told her I asked for manners at the table and got a glass hurled at my chest. I told her I asked for a conversation and got a courier with fancy paper and a clock. I told her I asked for respect and got an audience of strangers told that my home was already hers. I told her I prefer silence. But sometimes silence is consent. And I do not consent. She drew a breath that caught halfway. But Mr. Mercer said. The words died in her mouth. She looked toward Sylvia, then toward Gerald, then toward Augustine. Each face offered a different version of steady. None of them looked like truth. Gerald said, "You are humiliating your daughter." He said a gentleman would handle this privately. He said no one intends to hurt you. I said, a gentleman does not let a lie stand in his house. A gentleman does not sign away his roof to keep a party comfortable. A gentleman tells the truth plainly and lets the room decide what to do with it. Diana said, for the sake of completeness, Lawrence, if you wish to refer the letters to the bar for review, I will draft the complaint. If you wish to ignore them, I will document the request and the refusal. If they contact you again, instruct them to contact me. Do not answer directly. Thank you, Diana. Please stay a bit longer. I placed the lease copy on the mantel beside the deed and the tax summaries. Paper beside paper, facts beside facts. The arrangement looked almost ceremonial, the kind of altar that scares people who prefer stage lights to daylight. Sylvia stepped forward and asked Clara to put the phone down. Her hand fluttered near the camera like a moth. She said, "This is not content." She said, "This is family." She said, "Stop filming now." Clara did not move. Her fingers tightened. Her breath shook again. Augustine stood very still and stared at nothing. For the first time since I had met him, he looked like a man who had not planned for every angle. His shoulders withdrew the tucks, losing some of its weapons. Gerald's face drained to the color of paper. He looked smaller. He looked older. His mouth opened and closed once, twice without sound. The lines at his temples deepened. I took the phone from the mantel and lifted it again so Diana could hear me clearly. I said, "I am done being threatened. I am done being reframed. I am done with letters written to intimidate a man who is supposed to nod and step aside. The owner will remain the owner. The law will remain the law. Anyone who wishes to argue otherwise can do it with you on the line. Diana said that is clear. I am here." I lowered the phone and turned it face down on the mantel, the speaker still on. The room felt like a string wound tight. I let my hands fall to my sides. I did not look at the screen in Clara's grip, but I could sense it pulling the moment outward into thousands of rooms far away. I could feel the story changing shape in real time. Someone near the door whispered that the tide was turning. Someone else whispered that it had already turned. The lanterns outside swayed. A glass clinked. A chair leg squeaked. The party costumes looked like costumes again. Clara took a step back and bumped into the edge of a table. Her eyes flickered. Her lips parted. For a heartbeat, she seemed to reach for air. I saw the color roll out of her face like a tide leaving sand. The phone in her hand dipped, then rose, then dipped again. I stood very still and let the quiet do what it does. Clara drew a breath that sounded like fabric tearing. "I deserve everything," she shouted, and the words rang harder than the crystal. She kept going. "This is my future, my home, my life. She said you cannot keep me out of what is already mine." The room's heat, and the crowd, and the champagne, and the pressure, it all collected on her skin. Augustine said, "Clara, easy," and tried again for her elbow. She looked to Sylvia. She looked to me. She turned to the crowd, a ring of elegant faces, and raised her voice until it ran ragged. "This is responsibility. This is how strong families work. This is what grown women do." Someone whispered that she needed air. Another said, "Water." Isolde stepped from the shadow of the doorway, but stopped when Clara lifted her palm like a guard. I saw the color empty from Clara's face. She blinked again. Her knees gave up. The glass in her hand tilted, and the champagne flared in a bright arc. The phone slid as her fingers loosened. For a heartbeat, she hovered in the air, of her own certainty. And then the floor came to claim her. She went down hard on the rug, a sound like a book closing. The phone hit next, and bounced, camera rolling, catching a tilted slice of ceiling, then ankles, then a blur of faces leaning in. Sylvia screamed. Augustine dropped to his knees beside Clara, his hands shaking as he brushed hair from her cheek. Gerald barked for someone to call emergency services. Two guests already had their phones to their ears, voices fast and urgent as they gave the address. Isolde was the person who moved without a doubt. She knelt on the other side and checked Clara's forehead, then her wrist, then placed 2 fingers softly at her neck and counted. She spoke in a voice she uses for scared children. "Clara, can you hear me?" Stay with me. Take a breath. The room repeated the words in fragments, a prayer without a God. The live stream kept going. The fallen phone lay face up, the lens catching a sideways world. The screen showed her hair, the edge of her dress, Augustine's cuff button, a slice of chandelier. The chat flooded without pause. Some begged for privacy. Some begged for more. Some wrote that the truth had hit her harder than the floor. I picked up the phone from the mantel and said, "Diana, stay with me." Her voice came steady. "I am here. Do you need me to call dispatch?" I told her the call had been made. She told me to keep the space clear and to keep talking to Clara, even if she did not answer. I set the phone back down and crouched. Clara's eyes fluttered, rolled, closed, then opened in a narrow squint as if the light hurt. She tried to push herself up, failed, and let her head fall back to the rug. Isolde kept talking. "Good, breathe. That is it again." Augustine looked at Isolde with a helpless gratitude. Sylvia fanned the air with both hands. Gerald stared at the doorway as if he could pull the ambulance up the steps with his gaze. The guests formed a loose circle with space in the middle. A handful still held their phones high, the lens peering over shoulders. One of the servers said, "Please stop filming." No one heard him. Sirens threaded the night far at first, then closer, until the sound cut clean through the house. The front door swung wide for two paramedics in dark uniforms with calm faces. They spoke to Clara, to Isolde, to Augustine. They asked what happened and how long. They asked about alcohol and food and heat. They asked if she had ever fainted before. They asked if she had eaten. One paramedic took her pulse and watched his watch. The other checked her pupils, then asked for space and a blanket. A server brought a throw from the couch, and the paramedic tucked it over Clara's legs with the care of a mother. He said she needed air and water and space and said the rest would be decided at the hospital. He asked if there was a parent in the house. I said yes, and he nodded once without looking up. They lifted her with practiced gentleness to a gurney. Augustine stood to follow and fumbled his words. He said he would ride along. The paramedic said one person could come and waited. Sylvia moved first half step, then stopped. Gerald stepped later and then shook his head and said his knees. Augustine found his voice again and said, "Am her fiancé." The paramedic nodded. They guided the gurney through the foyer while the crowd parted like a curtain. The fallen phone still streamed. As the gurney passed, the lens caught Clara's face turned sideways. Eyes closed now, a line of perspiration at her temple. It caught Augustine's hand on the rail, white with tension. It caught Isolde following 2 steps behind. Then the picture jolted as someone finally picked the phone up and clicked the screen dark. The house pulsed with the sound of the departing siren. Guests began to talk again in quick, frightened bursts. Some apologized to no one. Some announced that they had medical training and then remembered they did not. A handful asked if I wanted them to stay. I said thank you and told them to go home to their families. The jazz trio packed their instruments without a word. The valets brought cars up the drive with their shoulders tight to their ears. Within minutes, the party had quieted to pockets of whisper. 2 young women sat on the stairs and stared at their phones with mouths open. One said, "It is already up everywhere." The other said, "It has a tag and a song." A young man in a velvet jacket cursed softly and said, "This is going to blow." A woman in silver clutched her purse to her chest. Isolde came to me with a glass of water. She touched my sleeve and asked if I was all right. I said yes and drank. She said she was going to the hospital after she made sure the house was settled. I told her to text me if she needed anything, and she promised she would. Gerald moved toward me and then away. Sylvia dabbed her eyes with a napkin. Augustine's car spun gravel as it left the drive. The tent lanterns swayed without music. The air tasted like salt and frosting. My phone began to buzz in a steady stream messages from numbers I did not recognize and a few I did. Links arrived faster than I could open them. Clips of a woman in a pale dress, framed by cake and flowers and a slow fall. Edits with captions that cut through the setup and landed only on the moment. I walked to the mantel and stacked the papers again. Deed, lease, bills. I slid them into the folder and closed it with my hand as if I were pressing a book shut. The music had ended. The guests had thinned to a handful who thought their hovering meant care. I thanked them gently, and they understood. When the last car pulled away, the house exhaled. The tide of the day went out. Somewhere far down the beach, a dog barked, and a gate clicked. I stood alone in the center of the room and listened to the lanterns tap each other and the soft rasp of the ocean on the sand. My phone lit again and again on the table behind me. By the time the lights were off and the door was locked, a dozen versions of the same 15 seconds were already circling the world, carving a path through feeds and group chats growing larger without any help from me at all. By morning, the clips had jumped from phones to pages that sell outrage for breakfast. By the end of the first day, a national tabloid used a line that stuck to everything it touched: an influencer who threw a glass at her father and then collapsed. The third day brought a tally that looked unreal on my screen: 3 million views across compilations and reposts and stitched reactions. I kept my phone face down as much as I could. Friends from Savannah sent polite messages that said they were thinking of me without asking for gossip. Tenants who knew me as the quiet man who fixed things sent short notes that said, "Hang in there." The ones I did not read were from numbers I did not know, offers to appear on shows, requests for comment attempts to buy a quote. Isolde called from the hospital not long after sunrise. She said Clara was awake, and the doctors were calling it stress and dehydration, and too much champagne at the wrong hour. They wanted to run labs and keep her under observation for a while. Isolde said she had told Clara to drink water and rest, and to stop looking at her phone. By noon, the collapse had been cut into a dozen storylines. None of them knew the slow years that come before a 15-second clip. None of them knew the little choices that lead to a glass flying and a body falling. When I came back to the house, Isolde was on the porch. She had left Clara sleeping and promised to return with dinner. I told her I had, and we both pretended I was not lying. The first brand email landed by late afternoon. They appreciated Clara, but in light of recent events, they were exercising a clause in the agreement and halting the campaign. By evening, Isolde texted me a screenshot Clara had sent her in a panic. 8 partnerships gone in one day. The next morning, agent or manager arrived in Clara's messages with sentences about optics and crisis management and cooling off periods. 130,000 followers gone in a week. The algorithm loves drama and hates aftermath. The next day, a black car rolled into the drive. Gerald and Sylvia had come without invitation. Gerald began by saying the situation had become outsized. He said this attention was disproportionate and hurtful. He said he understood the power of narrative, and that once a phrase sticks, it can ruin reputations. He asked if I might consider a statement to clarify that no one had intended harm. He suggested a sentence that would place the moment among the incidents that families endure and forgive. I asked how Clara was. Sylvia said she was resting. Gerald said she was strong. When I did not answer the request, Gerald moved to the point. He said my refusal to engage had forced them to make hard decisions. He said Augustine's board seats carried obligations and that investors were spooked. He said the firm and the family had to protect Mercer Realty. He told me they had advised their son to pause the engagement. I said I understood. I watched the marsh grass bend and straighten in the wind and thought that time does not heal so much as reveal. Isolde called from the hospital later that evening. She said Clara had learned about the pause from a text and had cried without sound for 10 minutes straight. She said Clara had tried to call Augustine, and he had not picked up. She said a part of her burned, and a part of her went cold, and she was not sure which part to feed. I told Isolde to take her home when they released her, and to keep the blinds closed for a few days. I told her I would cover anything she needed. She told me to sleep, and then asked if I would forgive Clara. I did not answer that question. Forgiveness is not a switch. It is a season. That night my phone miscarried notifications until I shut it off. In the morning, a friend from Beaufort sent a link to a business blog that had drawn a clean line across my living room. The post laid out numbers and guessed at others and labeled the moment a case study. They compared the fallout to fires they had seen in investor circles. They noted that a firm that wants to acquire your house should not do it with a live feed and a threat. They praised silence as strategy and called it discipline. Clara texted me without preface near noon. She asked to come by. She wrote that she wanted to talk with no cameras and no one else. When she arrived, she wore an oversized sweatshirt and a baseball cap pulled low. She looked smaller than I remembered, maybe because the posture that had been all purchase had fallen away. She stood in the doorway and looked at my face like a person checks a dock before stepping from a boat. We sat at the kitchen table. She did not reach for her phone. She did not ask for water. She took a breath and tried to speak and then tried again. She said the words, "I am sorry," and they sat between us like a heavy thing. She said she had thought she was protecting me. She said she had believed what she was told because it flattered her more than the truth. She said the word humiliation without letting it carry her away. She said Augustine was done. She said the partnerships were done. She said the future she had posted about was gone. I listened to all of it and watched her hands. They shook once and then stopped. I told her she had not lost a future. She had lost a fantasy. Futures are built. Fantasies are fed. She nodded and let that land. She asked if there was a way to fix the internet. I told her there is only a way to change what you do next. She asked if I would help her. I told her I would not rescue her. I told her I would listen. When she left, she looked around the kitchen, the way you look around a room you have not really seen in years. She touched the back of a chair and the edge of the counter and the frame of a photograph. She stood on the porch for a long breath and then walked to the car with her head down. I watched until the car turned and disappeared under the live oaks. The week filled with articles that used stills from the party. One showed Clara frozen with her mouth open, and the caption asked if privilege had a sound. Another cropped everything but the glass and wrote a paragraph that sounded like a sermon. A third used my face and invented a noble sentence I had not said. I learned not to click them. The numbers kept climbing. By Friday, a reporter left a card at my door. The station wanted to sit me under lights and paint the story as redemption. I tossed the card into a drawer. I fixed a loose hinge on a cabinet door and called a tenant back about a leaky shower. I met a crew at a duplex and checked the work, then signed a sheet and paid a man who had done a good job. I walked the beach at dusk and let the sea choose the tempo again. When I came home, the house was quiet. A few lanterns still hung where the party had been. They tapped softly against their lines in the breeze. My phone lay on the counter where I had left it. It lit once, twice, then rested. I looked at the folders on the mantel. Deed, lease, bills, proof stacked lightly. I thought about noise and about the clean space that follows after it burns out. Clara had lost reputation and work and the man who promised to carry her into a certain kind of life. The storm had taken what could be taken from a person who measured worth in eyes and hearts and deals. What remained would decide what kind of woman she might become. I stood in the dim light of my own kitchen and felt something like resolve settle in my bones. There were things I could control and things I could not. I had built an empire by knowing the difference. Elliot opened the vault. 3 assets: the beach house at Hilton Head, the Midtown Nashville building, where Clara has been living, and 520 Peachtree in Atlanta. Package them clean, individual, or as a bundle. Call Halcyon Atlantic. They get the first look. Cash only, no contingencies, 72-hour close. By 11:58, Marin called back with 3 letters of intent and a number that added to 15.4 million. All cash. Close by end of 3rd day. I told her to send the drafts to Diana and to put earnest money in escrow before she took lunch. Late that afternoon, Gerald called again. I answered. He tried for calm. He said he had heard Halcyon was circling. I told him circling was the wrong verb. He asked for a courtesy, a chance to match. I told him the package had a destination, and he was not it. He said families offer families the first bite. I said you tried to take the whole table. He started to say the word unfair and caught himself and hung up without saying goodbye. Day 3 began with the ocean, the color of nickel, and a quiet that felt like held breath. Elliot arrived with a notary. We signed deeds at the kitchen counter. At 10:42, the Nashville payoff confirmed. At 11:13, Peachtree settled. At 11:56, Hilton Head closed. By noon, my phone pinged 3 times in a row. Funds received. Funds received. Funds received. I walked out to the porch and let the air fill my lungs. I thought about the duplex on Victory Drive and about all the hours that had turned into this moment. I thought about the letter on cream paper and the girl who had believed a story because it made her bigger than the truth. I thought about mercy and about boundaries and about how business handles what sentiment cannot. The first notices went out within the hour. Residents at the Nashville building received clean instructions and a timeline for conversion. No one would be pushed into the street. Moves would be orderly. People would have choices. But the days of Clara holding a key she did not earn were numbered. At Peachtree, Halcyon served the buyout letter to Mercer and Fox. It named the fee. It named the date. It named the clause they had signed and forgotten. The calculation for the relocation ran in my head without effort. New space build-out. Move management. IT migration. Downtime for billable hours. It would clean hundreds of thousands off their books before the year turned. By mid-afternoon, Augustin called with a voice I had not heard from him, small and tight. He said this was retaliation. I said it was a sale. He said I had sold to the only buyer that would hurt his family. I said I had sold to the buyer that honored my terms. He said this was petty. I said this was business. He said again that we all wanted what was best for Clara. I told him to stop using her name as a tool. He told me I would regret creating enemies. I told him I was old enough to have buried a few. Isolde came by after school with a stack of worksheets to grade and a carton of strawberries. She sat on the deck and listened while I told her the numbers and the timing. She knew most of it already. She said she was proud of me and then laughed and said she knew I hated that word. I told her I could stomach it coming from her. She said she had stopped at the hospital gift shop and bought a silly card with a cat on it for Clara, because even foolish people deserve kindness when they are scared. I told her she was right. Near sunset, a car eased into the drive and paused as if asking permission from the gravel. Clara stepped out wearing a plain sweater and jeans and shoes without a logo. She walked up the path as if it might slide out from under her. She stood in the doorway and looked at me like a swimmer looks at a dock. She said she had heard about the sales. She said people were texting her with congratulations and condolences because they did not know what the numbers meant. She asked if it was true about the apartment. I told her it was. She asked if it was true about the law office. I told her the buyer had exercised a clause they had every right to use. She swallowed and said they would blame me. I said they had already blamed me. She took a breath and spoke faster words, tumbling and tripping. She said she was sorry for the party and the letters and the glass. She said she was sorry for the things she had said to people who wanted a show more than a life. She said she did not know how to fix any of it and did not know where to start. She said she was asking for forgiveness and for a little help, not money, but a hand, a plan, a place to stand. Her eyes shone in the gray light. Her hands were empty. I listened. I let my face stay still. I remembered the cafe at Forsyth and the years of automatic transfers and the way she had used the word ours like a key. I remembered the little girl who had asked for pancakes. I remembered the woman who had hurled a glass and a claim in the same motion. I told her I was listening. I told her I was not rescuing. The words landed gently and did not move. She closed her eyes and nodded as if bracing for a wave. She said she understood, and I believed her not because the sentence was perfect, but because she did not try to bargain after it. Isolde came to the doorway with the strawberries and the silly card. Clara tried to smile and failed, and then tried again and found a smaller one that fit. Isolde said she would drive her to the store tomorrow to buy a notebook and a pen and a calendar because sometimes paper helps when everything else is noise. Clara nodded and thanked her. The sun slipped and the house shifted into evening. On the counter, my phone glowed with a final email from Diana. All 3 recordings had been filed, all 3 transfers posted. She wrote one line that said, "Sleep now," and I almost laughed because I could not remember the last time I had done that, without waking to a number I had to move. Clara stood on the porch a moment longer, and then said good night. She walked down the path with slower steps than the ones that had carried her into glitter. Isolde followed her with the card in hand, then came back and leaned her head briefly against my shoulder. We stood there and listened to the water working the sand. The deals were done. The table had been moved. The people who had tried to write my ending were discovering they had not written the beginning. Inside the house, the papers lay where I had left them, quiet as stones. Outside, the lanterns made small circles of light on the deck, and the ocean kept time for all of us. 3 weeks reset the house into a quieter shape. Papers were filed, keys handed over, and I had a small use and occupancy window that let me sleep a few more nights here while I boxed the last pieces of my life. Clara came late on a Sunday. She looked like a woman who had been washed in cold water and hung to dry by the truth. She said she had taken a job at a cafe off Broughton Morning Line Register and milk frother and pastry tongs. First paycheck, she said, and then laughed at herself for saying it like a child. She took out a folded paper. She said she had written it so she would not wander. She said she had been greedy and proud. She said she had confused attention with love and applause with value. She said she had allowed other people to feed her a story that made her bigger than the roof she wanted to live under. She said she had used my silence as permission and my kindness as an ATM. She said she had called people followers because she could count them and had forgotten the kind who stand beside you when there is nothing left to post. She said she did not know if the internet could forget, but she hoped her life could remember. She said she wanted to learn the cost of things, not just the price, and she wanted to start by paying her own way. We sat at the table where I had eaten alone more often than I like to admit. She told me about the cafe. The manager had started her at the register because her hands shook too much on the machine, and then moved her to the machine because her hands stopped shaking when she focused on the sound. She said she was learning to write small names on big cups and to say good morning without hoping for a tip. She said a teacher had come in and smiled at her, and she had almost cried from the quiet of being treated like anyone else. I listened. She did not ask for money. She did not ask for a place to stay. She asked if I would have dinner with her somewhere simple so she could practice paying for something that mattered. I told her there was a diner on the causeway that still served pot roast on Sunday nights, a plate that tasted like the kind of comfort you earn at the end of a hard week. At the diner, she ordered roast green beans, the kind of roll that glistens. We ate without performance. She told me a story about a customer who apologized when he spilled sugar, and another who tipped in change and said he wished it were more. She laughed at herself for thinking tips were owed to her once. I told her about a tenant who left me a note about a humming air vent, the kind of small complaint that means a person believes you care. We talked like people who were not being watched. When the bill came, she reached for it with both hands. She pulled a folded stack of small bills from the envelope and counted carefully, then set the money under the edge of the plate. Tax tip everything. Her voice was steady when she said that felt like standing. Isolde met us at the house with a bag of groceries and a grin that belonged to a younger world. She hugged her sister and asked her about cappuccino foam like it was a science experiment. Clara laughed and said she could make a heart that looked more like a potato, and they both laughed at that. We sat on the deck with bowls of strawberries and listened to the quiet. No one reached for a phone. Later, Clara and I walked to the edge of the yard and stood near the dunes. She looked back at the house. She said she knew the sale had been right, even if it had cut her. She said she would not ask me to take it back. She said there was a time she would have called that a loss. Tonight, it felt like a door closing on a room that had trapped her without telling her the lock was on the inside. I told her I had one more lesson to offer, and it was not about money. I told her that love is not a ledger and respect is not a receipt. I told her I could forgive her and still refuse to carry her. I told her she could change and I would notice. She nodded and wiped her cheek with the back of her hand and said she would keep showing up. We walked back to the kitchen. She washed our glasses and set them to dry without being asked. She picked up her letter and slipped it into her bag. At the door, she paused and said she would be in early again. She had the opening shift and the morning rush waits for no one. I said I would stop by one day and pay for a coffee. She smiled and said I would not have to. I told her I expected to. She laughed and shook her head and said good night. She walked down the path with the calm steps of a person who has decided to own their weight. After she left, Isolde stayed a while and told me about a student who had finally read a whole page aloud. She said the boy had lifted his head like a runner crossing a finish line, and the class had clapped. She said small victories count because people are made of them. Before she went home, she rested her forehead against mine and said she loved me. The sun slid down the back of the sky, and the water blushed the color of copper. I took a chair to the edge of the deck and watched the light go soft over Hilton Head. The new owners would take full possession in a few days, and I would hand over the last key and carry my boxes to the little marsh cottage where mornings begin with birds instead of brand names. I did not feel regret. I felt arrival. Sometimes the sweetest revenge is not taking anything from anyone, It is letting them learn the value of what they thought they deserved. If you are listening to this, tell me where you are. Share the city or the back road or the shore where my voice found you. If any piece of this felt like your life, tap like share this story and subscribe so I know you are out there. I want to hear how many of you have stood where I stood and kept your footing when the whole room wanted you to fall.